get stuck and you want to look at that, you can. Right, so you're all here because you want to help patients get better, and that's why I went into medicine as well. And diabetes is one of the biggest problems that we face in general practice, as you all know. So first up, you don't really need me to tell you this, to be honest, but I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what diabetes is. You've got type 1, you've got type 2. Type 1, as you know, does have genetic components, HLA genotypes, but it is essentially an autoimmune disease. So, you have some sort of environmental trigger, which then leads you to, those of you who are genetically susceptible, to develop diabetes. Type 2, again, it does have strong genetic links, but overwhelmingly, lifestyle plays the biggest factor as to whether you're going to get type 2 diabetes or not. And it's essentially driven by insulin resistance rather than an autoimmune process. So those are the two main differences between these types of diabetes. What we see as well is type 1.5 diabetes, which we're becoming more aware of. And essentially what you need to think of if you want to know more about type 1.5, it can also be known as latent autoimmune diabetes of adult onset. Essentially, it's a bit like type 1 in the sense that it's mediated by an autoimmune process, but it tends to occur in adults. So it's confusing because you see an adult who you think, oh, okay, well it's probably type 2 because they're an adult, but actually what you'll notice the difference is that their disease is not mediated by insulin resistance. And it's actually up to 20% of adult diabetics are actually type 1.5. And one of the things that makes it harder to diagnose is because initially in the disease process, some of the drugs that you're giving to combat type 2 diabetes are actually working. But you'll tend to notice that the ones that aim to combat insulin resistance don't tend to work. And they tend to need to go to insulin far more quickly than you would expect for a normal progression of type 2 diabetes. So that's something to think about, and if you're not sure, it's probably worth referring to an endocrinologist for further help, because they do have a slightly worse prognosis overall than you'd expect for their size, because it's not driven by insulin resistance. So briefly on the topic of type 1 diabetes, this is research that not many people know about. We do know that it's essentially mediated, as I say, by an autoimmune reaction, but why does this happen? Well, sometimes it's a viral exposure, sometimes it's a bacterial exposure, and sometimes it's an exposure to a pathogen that you wouldn't have even considered. So take cow's milk, for example. There's two mechanisms by which cow's milk exposure can actually predispose you to type 1 diabetes. And there are quite a few studies to back this up. And it's thought to be around the topic of molecular mimicry. So for those who are genetically susceptible, if they've been exposed to beta-casein proteins, they look remarkably similar to pancreatic beta cells. And so if you're going to mount an immune response to such a protein, then you would also potentially mount the same response to your own pancreatic beta cells. And there are some studies on Finnish children who were exposed to cow's milk proteins in the first 3 months of life, and they were far more likely to go on to develop type 1 diabetes if they were genetically susceptible to it. Another interesting exposure around cow's milk is also the exposure to a type of bacteria, and it's called Mycobacterium avium paratuberculosis, or MAP. And that is also linked to the development of type 1 diabetes. One study I read showed that 100% of patients that they tested had antibodies to MAP, this particular bacterial exposure, which comes through exposure to cow's milk and also meat in general. And this is an interesting thing, because you don't really think of it, but basically in the slaughterhouse you've got the animal, and you're going to be trying to keep everything as clean as possible, but invariably you will get some intestinal spillage as part of the slaughtering process. And that does tend to then lead to cross-contamination of the meat. So you can get these particular MAP bacterial samples in meat products. The most commonly found meat product with it is like minced beef. So that's something to consider, which not many people know about. So anyway, that's an aside, because it's nothing really to do with the main crux of the talk, which is type 2 diabetes. But it is very interesting. So UK figures, nearly 4 million people are suffering. In Ireland, it's about 1 in 15. 1 in 15 of us will have diabetes. I'm sure all of you see a lot of diabetic patients at various stages of their disease, and you know, it's a huge problem, as we're all aware. But not just because of the usual things like trying to maintain their blood sugars, but because of how they die. Because, just to remind you guys, that 80% of diabetics will die of heart disease, a heart attack or a stroke. You know, and so they are far more susceptible to our biggest killer. And of course, it's not just that, it's not just a heart attack or a stroke, but you've got all of the other peripheral effects of having high blood sugar. And we all know these effects, we see them every day. You know, people with their diabetic neuropathy, diabetic nephropathy, diabetic retinopathy, you know, gastric paresis. There's so many, impotence, I almost forgot to mention that one. It's obviously hugely important to many of us. You know, there are so many different reasons why having a high blood sugar can lead to toxic effects. And we know this to be true. But why does this happen? It's very confusing. So patients get confused, dietitians get confused, doctors get confused, and these are the kinds of comments that you're probably going to hear. Hands up, who has heard a patient say, I can't eat carbs because I'm diabetic? Yeah, loads of us. What about fruit? Any of your diabetic patients? Yeah, yeah, hands up. Diabetic patients say, I can't have fruit, I can't have a banana, it's going to bring my blood sugars up, it's bad for me. They think it's all about willpower, which I think, you know, actually is really sad, because there are so many different determinants in society that make it actually tremendously difficult to lose weight. And I hate this aspect of almost self-guilt and self-flagellation over, oh, if only I was a better person, if only I could have more willpower. I get a lot of that with my patients, and I really try and steer them away from that, because honestly, it's actually not their fault. We live in a very obesogenic world. Genetics. Some people are very fatalistic, I mean, I can't do anything about it, it's just my genes. And keto diets as well are really popular. Does anyone have any patients who tried a keto diet for diabetes? Yeah, okay. So I'm interested to talk afterwards about their experiences if you've seen those. So in this kind of quagmire, where do we sort of get some answers? That's what I'm hoping this lecture's going to do. Help you to unpick some of those myths around why it happens and what the solutions are, and also to boost your confidence. You're all healthcare practitioners. This is an amazing opportunity for you guys to change lives. So I'm really excited for you, because I'm hoping that if I can explain it in a way that you can understand, then it's easier for you to explain to your patients. And at this point, it's really important. If you could think of at least one or two patients in your mind's eye who you think that this information might help, and think of them as you watch the slides and hear me talk, and think of ways that you can explain this to them to help them change their lifestyle. So before we begin, I'll just quickly go through what general advice is given for diabetics. Current guidelines talk about the importance of fruits and vegetables, obviously, making sure that you have lean protein foods, less added sugar, no trans fat. This is the American Diabetic Association and diabetes.org. They kind of go along the same sort of lines, and this is really good general advice, and I think it does generally improve health for most people. I don't think it induces diabetes reversal though, and that's the end game. That's what we really want to help people with. So although it's all good, I don't think it quite goes far enough. And so today, I will talk to you guys about three main ways in which diabetes can ostensibly be reversed, and which one I think is obviously beneficial. And I know that you know where I'm going with this, but we will go through each of them in turn so that you understand them all in a bit more detail. The first physician to have an idea that diet played a role with this sort of glucose in the urine problem was Apollinaire Bouchard. I think I got his name right. He was French, and he lived in Paris. And he had patients that had glucose in their urine. And there was a siege in Paris in 1870, and there was therefore a massive food shortage, which meant that there was not enough to eat. And remarkably, he noticed that in those patients that were urinating glucose, the problem disappeared, and they were able to get a lot more well because they were not eating. Essentially, it was caloric restriction that did it. Much more recently, we have the DIRECT trial, which was published in The Lancet, It was done in Liverpool, I think, and it was pretty groundbreaking. What they managed to show was a very successful diabetes reversal trend through caloric restriction. So they had, it was a randomized control trial. They had two groups of patients, and the ones with the intervention were essentially given really calorie-restricted diets, about 850 calories a day, I think it was, and they were given shakes and soups to eat. And the results were remarkable. I think there was nearly 300 people, and half of the people in the intervention group went into complete remission of their diabetes. Nearly half. It was very impressive. Great, you think, well, that's wonderful. Well done, everybody. 6 months, 12 months, great results. To be honest, I don't think I could live off shakes and soups for more than a week. I just don't know how they did it. It's really great, but tremendously difficult. I haven't seen any free-range humans that have been able to live off shakes and soups for more than a few days, let alone years, which is what potentially people might be having to do with this kind of intervention. So it works, but is it sustainable long-term? Well, I leave you to decide. I don't think it is. Another way of doing it is through the low carbohydrate diet. There's a lot of people that are proponents for low carbohydrate approaches, and the premise is simple. You eat less sugar, you make less insulin, you improve your diabetes. It sounds so logical, and it makes so much sense. In fact, the Public Health Collaboration in the UK talk about the importance of low-carb diets for this very reason. Then you've got organisations like diabetes.org that talk about it as well. Then you've got people, GPs, like Dr David Unwin. He's a really nice guy. He's from Southport, and he has a sort of 10-step program helping his patients with a low-carb diet to help improve their diabetes. So it definitely has merits, and the studies that I've put on the right-hand side of the slide, they're all from the Public Health Collaboration website. So I looked at all these studies, and what's interesting to me is that they're all short-term studies. So you can get people to improve their diabetes in the short term if you cut the carbs, yes. But no long-term studies that I could see showed long-term benefits for this approach. And also, all the studies showed caloric restriction. These people were actually calorically restricted, so they had less energy, so they were less overweight, therefore reduced their risk factors for diabetes less. So I don't think it's necessarily the best solution, but it is one of the ways in which people can achieve benefits. But does this play out long term? And does it even play out when you look at what human physiology actually does? Well, not necessarily, no. Kevin Hall did some amazing research that was funded by the National Institutes of Health, and he was able to prove through the studies that actually when the patients went into a metabolic ward where everything was hugely monitored and controlled, keto diets did nothing for weight loss over caloric restriction. In fact, what they were actually showing was that the fat metabolism changed so that there was more muscle loss for the patients that were doing keto compared to a higher carbohydrate caloric restriction diet. And long term, the metabolic rate actually slowed, so it was less effective, which is fascinating because people go on and on about keto, and yes, I don't want to put people off something that's really helpful personally. I find it it's challenging when someone says, look, this has really helped me, and I don't feel necessarily that it's the most healthy way, but I don't want to tell them that they shouldn't have done that, because everybody has their own personal experience. But looking at how the body actually works, then they might be causing themselves long-term harm, but also in the short term, it's not any more effective than simple caloric restriction, and it can actually reduce muscle mass. And like I said before, there are potential long-term side effects and problems with a lower carbohydrate approach, because you have to think, well, what am I replacing my healthy carbohydrates with? Am I replacing them with a healthy food subgroup? These studies show that when you are long-term trying to sustain a lower carbohydrate diet, what you're actually doing is causing stiffening of your arteries compared to a higher healthy carbohydrate diet. You're reducing blood flow to the heart. So there was one direct study that compared a lower carbohydrate and a higher carbohydrate healthy diet on the coronary arteries. and there was less blood flow to coronary arteries with the lower carbohydrate approach. These are both healthy diet approaches, by the way. It increases oxidative stress. Dr. Ulrich talked about the role of LPS from gram-negative bacteria. So basically, when you have high saturated fat in your diet from animal products, then it causes a slight sort of break to the intestinal lining, which then allows these gram-negative bacteria that are living inside the gut to then migrate from the gut to the bloodstream, which causes massive amounts of oxidative stress, which you can obviously deal with when you have the odd meal, bacon and eggs, whatever. But if you're doing that every day, it can cause a big problem. So this is sort of why I'd say long-term low-carb approaches definitely need to be reviewed. And it's not just the saturated fat, it's also the increased animal protein, which again, already touched on earlier, specifically increased all-cause mortality the higher animal protein you consume. But for diabetics, what I found really interesting when I looked into this is that high animal protein also drives your insulin response. And this fascinating study actually shows us that high protein foods drive insulin response more relative to their glycemic load than high carb foods. So this is fascinating. Basically, I think if you look at the graph on the right, you can see that beef had a very high insulin response relative to its glycemic load. So it had a similar overall response to brown rice, I think it was, and fish had a similar response to whole grain bread, which I found absolutely fascinating. So, you know, we have, and we make glucose as well. If we're not having glucose in the diet, by the process of gluconeogenesis, we make more of it in our bodies because our body prefers it. It's our natural preferred energy source, especially for the brain. So our bodies end up making glucose if we're eating more protein, which many people don't realise. But what other effects are there? So when you eat, I think it'd probably be worth just explaining a little bit about how we digest our food and why this is important for insulin resistance, because I'm going to explain something to you now that I don't think we've had explained in medical school, which is really important for us to know. When you have a high-fat diet, what happens is it goes into your stomach and it naturally slows the gastric emptying, making you feel a little bit fuller for longer, but it does slow that process down. And then those dietary fatty acids go directly into the bloodstream far more quickly than the protein and glucose-containing foods. So they form into these little chylomicrons, they go around the bloodstream, and your fat and your muscle and your liver take them in far more readily. So there's no stop button on that, they just have to absorb it. Which is why if you have a higher fat diet, you will have a higher proportion of fat globules in your muscle, inside your muscle, intramyocellular fat, but you also have more fat globules in your liver, fatty liver, and you'll have more fat globules in your adipose tissue. Well, not necessarily more fat cells, but they fill up. And what happens when your fat cells fill up is that they swell, but they can't swell forever, so then they burst. And those fat cells, when they burst, you get the free fatty acids spilling out into the interstitial tissue. Other cells around the fat notice, and they start to release these inflammatory cytokines, and then you get more of those, macrophages from the bloodstream munching in, trying to kill them off, trying to protect the body. And you've got this process of low-grade oxidative stress that occurs just from having more fat cells with more fatty acids in them. And this causes insulin resistance inside your fat cells as well as other parts of your body. But let's talk about what happens next. So I mentioned that the fat gets absorbed more quickly. So what happens is insulin resistance. So this is a normal, if you imagine this is a normal cell right here, you've got the glucose in red, and then you've got these little bits of insulin in blue, and then the insulin receptors on the cell lining, they have to grab the glucose and the insulin to allow the glucose into the cell where it's needed for energy. So there's a lock and key mechanism, if you like, okay? So remember what I said with fat, there's no lock and key, it just has to go in. And that's why the fat cells are so important, because they protect the muscles and the liver from having to take on too much of this extra fat in the bloodstream. But there is a lock and key mechanism for glucose. very important. Insulin is needed. Insulin is the great transporter hormone. It transports not only glucose, but also proteins, funnily enough. It does transport fats too, but it doesn't need to. So this is the difference. Insulin is needed. But what happens when you have a lot of fats to start with, the free fatty acids, they actually down-regulate these insulin receptors on the lining. So you've got less of them, and the ones that you have are all clogged up as well. So it's a bit like a lock and key, and the fat causes the lock to jam so that you can't get the key into it. And that means that the glucose from the bloodstream can't get inside the cell where it's needed for energy. And it gets stuck in the bloodstream. The pancreas notices, and the pancreas thinks, I need to make more insulin because there's too much glucose in the bloodstream and that's toxic. So more insulin is produced. And then you're in a dire situation because you've got more glucose in the bloodstream, which can't get inside the cell where it's needed, and then you've got more insulin in the bloodstream as well, trying to mop up the glucose. But it doesn't matter how many new keys you make, if the lock is jammed, you're not going to be able to open the door. And that is insulin resistance. That is the key to insulin resistance. And that's what many of our patients don't understand, and many of us don't understand, which is why a whole food plant-based diet is so empowering. Let me explain why. So that was the normal cell. This is what I've just described. So can you see? These gold receptors are the ones that have been down-regulated, the ones that have clogged up and become jammed, which means that the insulin cannot bind to the receptor with the glucose and let the glucose in. So that's a pictorial representation of the difference between somebody who is normally functioning and somebody who has insulin resistance. And insulin resistance doesn't just cause diabetes, obviously. It causes polycystic ovarian syndrome, metabolic syndrome, and increased risk of heart disease in general. So it affects a lot of us. So is there any actual data on humans to sort of show this mechanism? Well, yes, there is. Oh no. It's not coming up. Let me just see if the next slide does it. Hang on. Oh, okay. Here we go. My PowerPoint skills are just amazing, aren't they? Yeah. No. There. So this is some research to back up what I was just saying to you guys. Imperial College decided to look at vegans versus omnivores and check out their muscle to see how their muscle worked. And what's interesting is that these are people that are matched by age, matched by gender, matched by BMI. So they were the same weight, they were the same age, they were the same sex. And what was interesting is that the people that had a vegan diet had significantly less fat trapped inside the muscles. They had much higher insulin sensitivity, and they had better blood glucose and insulin levels compared to people who were the same age, the same sex, the same weight, and improved beta cell function. So the beta cells in the pancreas that make the insulin were working much more efficiently. And why is that? Well, again, I mean, it's about the saturated fat, unfortunately. This graph shows you that beta cells are very sensitive to the effects of specifically palmitate, which comes from animal products primarily. And in the lab, you can see that if you put pancreatic beta cells, mix them in with this palmitate from animal fat, look at the amount of time in hours compared to the beta cell death that occurs. So palmitate is in the black, and oleate, that's another kind of oil, that's found in stuff like olives and you know, avocados and nuts and things like that. There's absolutely no effect on cell death when you're giving them these healthy plant fats, whereas when you're giving them the animal fats primarily, cell death occurs. We don't make new pancreatic beta cells after about the age of 20. Once they die, they're gone. This is why I get very passionate about this topic, because I see diabetic patients who are trying keto, eating all this animal protein and fat, and killing off their pancreatic beta cells is dangerous. So this is something that I think everybody needs to know about. Now, what else is interesting about this is when we look at people who have had to be on insulin for a long time, okay? Now this study was done on people who've had diabetes for so many years, type 2 of course, so many years that they needed to have insulin. So they're either very, very insulin resistant, so insulin resistant that their pancreas have kind of stopped, they've kind of given up. the pancreas has stopped making new insulin, and so then you need to use injected insulin. Some people say that it's just the caloric restriction that allows a whole food plant-based diet approach to work for diabetes, because that's what works in general. We know that from what I've said to you before, and we know that from the low-carb studies as well. This study proves that it's not just caloric restriction. It's fascinating. They got these 20 men, so this shows you 20 men, all with diabetes and all having to inject insulin. They've been diabetic for 20 plus years. They made them eat a whole food plant-based diet, and they also forced them not to lose weight. So if they were starting to lose weight, they forced them to eat more food. Because they wanted to see what the effects would be on their diabetes with no weight changes at all. And the results are absolutely remarkable. Within just 2 to 3 weeks, can you see, these are men that have been on insulin for years. Half of them able to come off insulin completely. No need for insulin whatsoever. Because their insulin sensitivity had improved, even when their pancreases had pretty much given up at that stage. Their insulin resistance melted away, which meant that their pancreatic beta cells that they had left worked well again, which meant that they didn't need insulin anymore. It didn't work for everybody, but they all had improvements. Can you see the difference between the numbers? This is the insulin, the injectable insulin in units, and this is after 2 or 3 weeks of a whole food plant-based diet. So all of them improved, but some of them improved so remarkably. And these are the ones who still had a functioning pancreas, even after all that battering for all those years. And there is a historical precedent for this. Back in the 1950s, Walter Kempner did some experiments with people reversing their diabetic retinopathy. So this is before, this is after. He made them eat, I'm not sure if people who, I don't know, who's familiar with this study? Hands up who knows about this study. Handful of you. So he made them eat white rice and fruit, which if you're trying a low-carb diet is like the devil. White rice, not even whole grain. He made them eat white rice and fruit, and look at the improvements in their diabetic retinopathy. Now, I had my first clue about this when I had a patient who had severe diabetes and heart disease. He was genetically predisposed to high cholesterol. He was really, really sick, and in his 40s. Anyway, he decided to go on holiday, right? He went to one of the Caribbean islands. He wasn't a man for a quiet life. He got arrested while he was there for drug smuggling. So he was in a prison in the Caribbean for quite some time. What I noticed when he came back, I said to him, "How are you?" He said, "I'm fantastic." I'm like, "What, really?" He said, "Yeah, my diabetes is gone." I was like, "What?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "What did they give you? What did you eat?" And he said, "Oh, I just ate loads of rice and beans." And back then, I had no idea about all this research, but I couldn't compute. It's like, how could your diabetes be better if you're eating rice and beans? The very thing that popular culture says will make your diabetes worse. Anyway, he went back to his old eating habits when he came home, bacon and eggs, and sadly he got worse again. So it's not the best story in terms of long-term outcomes for this gentleman, but it was one of the first things that really alerted me to the fact that the dogma that I had absorbed wasn't necessarily the whole picture. So now I've explained a little bit around the mechanism of studies, don't we? I love studies anyway. So this one was done by Hannah Calliover at Washington, and it's quite new, that's why I included it. It's a couple of years old. And what she was able to show was that a whole food plant-based diet improved body composition. Again, this is over and above weight loss. So they had a randomized control trial. They had 2 lots of different people, 16 weeks. One of them had a sort of a diabetes association diet intervention, and the other one had a whole food plant-based diet intervention. And what they were able to show was that it was specifically reducing certain proteins in the diet, histidine and leucine in this case. They associated with far better biological parameters than just simple weight loss. And the same study was actually published in a different journal where they looked at the famed thigh gap, where they measured the thigh circumference of the people that took part in the study. And those who were on a whole food plant-based diet had better thigh gaps than the diabetic patients who were not, which might be of interest to some of you, I don't know. But they also had reduced subfascial and intracellular fat. So both groups lost subcutaneous fat as part of the intervention, but it was only the whole food plant-based group that also lost subfascial and intracellular fat. And we know, don't we, that intracellular fat drives insulin resistance from what I discussed earlier, which is why it's so beneficial to eat this way. And this is the kind of thing that they were given, all right? Isn't that pretty? Look at all those lovely whole foods, straight from nature. Lots of leafy greens, vegetables, fruits, grains, pulses, lentils, seeds and nuts, DHA. That would be the whole food plant-based pyramid. And what I love about this research is that, again, caloric restriction is not needed. So this study was done by Dr. Bernard, who's been mentioned before, and they got 100 people with diabetes. And what they did was they evaluated them at the start and nearly 6 months in, and they gave them, again, the diabetes diet that has been promoted, and also the vegan diet, a whole food plant-based vegan diet, not the junk food vegan diet, obviously. And remarkably, those who had a whole food plant-based diet, they had half of them, that's right, half of them were able to reduce all of their diabetes medications in 6 months, and compared to about a quarter of the ones who were doing the American Diabetes Association diet. But the body weight reduced by double the amount in the whole food plant-based cohort, and also they doubled the reduction in their LDL cholesterol in the whole food plant-based cohort. And this is compared to the diabetes diet that is recommended nationally. So they were all going to do better, but can you see how dramatic the difference was when they had a whole food plant-based approach? I think our patients need to know this, don't you? They need to know. They don't have to do it, but if they know it, then that's really empowering. Dr. Joel Furman did a study as well. He has something called the nutritarian diet, which is basically a whole food plant-based diet, but he wants to call it nutritarian because he's a little bit different. Lovely man, but anyway, so essentially his idea is that you maximise the nutrients and minimise the calories. So it's kind of like longevity research in a sense, because we want to get the maximum amount of nutrients and the minimum amount of calories. That's his whole premise, and he does that through whole food plant-based nutrition. So he's not an ideologue in that sense. Like he wouldn't class himself as vegan or anything like that. He just follows the science, okay? And so this is the study that he did. He had, I can't remember how many people were in this study, but you can see how many months that they followed his diet plan compared to the HbA1c. Look how much it dropped. Everybody had a big drop in the HbA1c. And you can see on the left what they were told to eat. So if you're not sure, you can just take a screenshot of that and think, okay, well that's what the nutritarian diet is, essentially whole food plant-based, and that's the results that people can achieve. My favourite of all these studies that don't involve caloric restriction, I keep having to say that because it's very impressive, again, that the whole food plant-based diet can do this without having to tell people that they need to restrict themselves, is one that's come from New Zealand. And who's heard of the Broad study? Yeah, a few. One of my favourites because it was done by GPs. And they got about 60 people and they put them into 2 cohorts. One was a control group and one they were giving a diet intervention advice. Basically, I think a couple of times a week they were meeting up and advising them to eat more whole food plant-based diets. They had greater weight loss at 6 and 12 months than any other study that we know of that did not mandate caloric restriction or regular exercise. And these people were overweight, or they had diabetes, or they had high cholesterol, and there were some really great improvements. But it's not just these kinds of randomised controlled trials that are useful. It does help to look at populations. And if you're not familiar, some of the big population studies are the Nurses' Health Study, Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, Adventist Health Study. Those are some of the big 3, if you like. What they did was researchers got some of the results from the Nurses' Health, which was basically women, and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, which was men. The higher risk of diabetes. And This slide everybody has probably seen from multiple lectures, but it's the Adventists. So the Adventists are a group in Loma Linda, California, which is one of the blue zones, and they have really high healthy longevity. It's the only blue zone that I'm aware of that's not an island, so it gives on, well, it offers some hope. Obviously Ireland is an island, so maybe this could be a blue zone one day. But what they showed was that the Adventists in general are very healthy people. Part of their religious structure is that they believe that they're going to inhabit their bodies in the afterlife, so they take good care of their bodies in their current form. And so they generally wouldn't drink a lot of alcohol, they wouldn't use drugs, or they try and stay active and fit, but they would vary a little bit in what they ate. And here on the left, BMI of these Adventists gradually reduced to a normal BMI when they had a whole foods plant-based diet, compared to when they were lacto-vegetarian, fish vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, or non-vegetarian. And the same exact prevalence can be seen for the type 2 diabetes incidence in that population. But these photographs as well, they just show you how awesome these people in Loma Linda are. Like they're super active, in their 90s, up to 100, driving their car, going to fitness classes, doing all the things that they would normally do. And that's what we want, isn't it? We want to be able to be healthy, not just live to 100. You don't want to live to 100 if you're disabled or had a stroke. You want to be able to enjoy your life. And that's what these people do. So is there any reason why, any other reason? I mean, I think I've covered quite a lot of reasons why this is beneficial, but there are a couple more that I have to mention before we go for lunch. Well, hopefully we're having a whole food plant-based lunch, aren't we? Okay, so the reason it works, apart from what I've already told you around insulin resistance and how our bodies metabolize these different macronutrients, simply there's more bulk, isn't there? There's more fibre, okay? It keeps you full because it fills up your stomach, your stretch receptors kick off, and then your satiety hormones can tell your brain that you're full and you've had enough food. And in fact, this study from Nutrients, so this is a graph on the right from Nutrients Journal, and it was published not that long ago, and it proved that a whole food plant-based diet does actually keep you full, right, because of the extra fibre, which is interesting. So what they did is they looked at 3 satiety hormones, well, I'm just going to come over a point. So you've got peptide Y1, GLP-1, amylin. These are the 3 satiety hormones that they looked at. And they wanted to ask people who were taking part, are you full? Do you feel full? So that was the satiety graph as well, okay? And then they got 3 different they got 3 different cohorts of people. They got diabetics, they got people who were obese but not diabetic, and they got people who were a healthy weight. So that's diabetic, overweight, healthy. And what they found was that in each of the groups, they the satiety hormones and the feeling of being satiated was higher with the vegan diet compared to the omnivorous diet that they were given, which is really interesting because a lot of us psychologically feel you're not going to necessarily have enough, but you don't need to calorically restrict, and if you eat to your satisfaction, then you will feel full, according to the data. And what lecture series is not complete without a mention of the microbiome? It's the modern day obsession. I do think it's the new frontier of medicine. We've had genetics, we've had hormones, now we've got the microbiome. It's really interesting. The reason that a whole food plant-based diet helps you with diabetes, another one, is because of its effect on your microbiome. So the fibre breaks down into short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, butyrate, the main 3 that we know about. And what's amazing is not only do they feed your beneficial gut bugs, these short-chain fatty acids, they feed your good gut bugs, which help important metabolic processes like making hormones, certain vitamins, neurotransmitters. But actually, amazingly, these short-chain fatty acids that come from beans and rice and fruits and vegetables, they actually improve beta cell function. They improve beta cell function. Propionate, one of the main short-chain fatty acids that are produced in the gut, in the small intestine when you are digesting your beans and your vegetables and your fruits and your whole grains, actually improves beta cell function. And it stimulates insulin in a healthy way. So, how about that? Pretty good, isn't it? So how do people do it? I love these guys. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're really nice. And they do an amazing program. They're both type 1 diabetics. They've got an incredible personal story. I won't bore you because we will probably want lunch soon. But they're lovely guys. They run a program called Mastering Diabetes, and they get tremendous results for their patients because they know what it's like to live with diabetes, and they have optimized their insulin sensitivity. So these guys, obviously, they're never going to be able to not be on insulin unless there are some new breakthroughs around, genetics of insulin production and beta cells in the pancreas. It's not going to happen for them. But they allow people with type 1 diabetes to attain a normal lifespan through optimizing insulin sensitivity, and they are able to help people with type 2 diabetes pretty much come off their medications unless they have become so insulin resistant that their pancreas has given up. So they have incredible results, and they've got a book as well that's come out this week, last week, which is brilliant. So you can buy the book, or you can tell your patients to buy the book, and they will improve their diabetic outcomes considerably if they follow their simple advice. It's really simple, actionable advice. There is other books that your patients can buy. So if you're not sure what to tell them, even if you've got a 10-minute consult, you can't say, "Oh, stuff I've just told you," can you, in 10 minutes? But you can say, "Look, just buy this book, all right? Go have a read, come back to me with any questions, and then we can talk about how you're going to do this. Or buy this book." So this book is by Dr. Bernard, who did one of the studies I mentioned, and this book is by Dr. Thurman, who does the Nutritarian Diet. It's simple, easy books to read, and the patient can hopefully really gain something from that. Oh yeah, hang on, I forgot to say, I'm writing a book. It's exciting. So when that's out, you can perhaps buy that, because I have a whole chapter on diabetes in that as well. So January 2021, buy my book. Right, your patients have lots of reasons for eating, and they're not just hunger. We think about things that we love from childhood. We think about tastes and sensations that give us pleasure, things that our friends eat, what our friends have made at their houses, what's at the train station. There's a ridiculous amount of different reasons why we would choose the foods that we choose. In fact, research from UCL tells us that we make over 200 unconscious food choices every single day, and only about 13 conscious food choice decisions. So it's complicated, but if we can become aware of it, then it can help us make better decisions around that small percentage that we're actually conscious of. So we have to figure out what is the motivation to change. For your patients, what is their why? Why would they change their diet? You have to help them to see a better future. You have to be enthusiastic with them. You have to believe in them. Because if you believe in them, then they can believe in them, and they will become more accountable to the changes that you're suggesting. And they'll be far more enthusiastic if you think that they can do it. Simple swaps is always really good to tell people. So ask them, what do you like? What is your favourite food? Write down a list of the things they like to make, the things they like to eat, and then, if you have the time, which you may not, you could tell them a few simple meal swaps, or tell them to look up online. Oh, okay, you like a chicken curry. There's a really good chickpea curry recipe that the Happy Pair who are coming shortly will show you on YouTube or something. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. These interventions, we think that they'll take hours, but they don't necessarily. If you've got somebody who's got the right motivation, you give them the right enthusiasm and the right support, they go away and they can do it all themselves, believe it or not. It doesn't necessarily require you to hold their hand every step of the way. But what is required is your enthusiasm and your belief in what they can achieve. Oh, yes. So go back to that one patient, or those two patients maybe that you thought of. Now that you've had the lecture, now that you've got the information, think about the most important thing for them. What do they need to know from this talk? And what would help them to change their lives for the better? Have a real think about that. I've put a few references at the end, just because there are so many. These are the studies I couldn't even include. Oh, hang on, she wants to take a picture. And another one. And then there's another one. So just be aware, there is so much research out there about the benefits of healthy plant-based nutrition for diabetes. Enjoy, I hope you do your own research, and thank you so much for listening today. Thank you so much.